Hi, I am Meredeth White. I'm Director of Hatchery Operations with Atlantic Aqua Farms. I met many of you for the first time last winter and spring, and I have been very grateful to have the opportunity to get to know this industry better over the last year, or since that time. Today I'm going to update you on Atlantic Aqua Farms' short-term and long-term approaches to produce disease-resistant seed. Great. So, most of you know, but Atlantic Aqua Farms is a PEI company founded in the 1980s and currently employing about 225 people around the province, growing and processing and distributing mussels and oysters. We have mussel leases all around the island, oyster leases in Savage Harbor and Rustico Bay, and then in pink, I have highlighted, let's see, oh, nope. In Borden, that is our hatchery, and in Rustico Bay is our nursery. In recent years, the company expanded to include oyster hatchery and farming operations in Maine and Virginia as well. We have 2 hatcheries in Maine and 1 in Virginia. So today I'm going to talk about our long-term approaches, including quantifying existent MSX resistance, establishing a breeding program for disease resistance, and collaborating on external research projects. I'll also get into our short-term approach, which is our proposal that many of you are aware of to import disease-resistant broodstock or seed from the United States. And we do feel that both approaches are necessary for dealing with the MSX and dermo outbreaks. The short-term approach could feasibly sustain the industry while Atlantic Canada breeding programs are further established. So going back to long-term approaches, for the project that this project that I'm speaking about here, it's funded by DFO, and we were working to quantify existent MSX resistance in PEI. So the objectives here are to estimate susceptibility of oysters from different areas of PEI, establish populations of candidate MSX resistant broodstock, potentially MSX resistant, and test the viability of larvae from those broodstock. So our approach was to use oysters from 2 populations that you already just heard about, one from the Biddeford River and one from Savage Harbor. At the time that we were starting this project, based on the province's testing, the Biddeford River had a 23 prevalence rate for MSX and cultured oysters, and Savage Harbor had a 0% prevalence rate. We used 3-year classes of oysters from each population, and we located all of them at the Biddeford River. So the idea here was to compare mortality in different year classes from multiple populations, including one population that had already been exposed to MSX and one that we were introducing to MSX by moving from Savage Harbor to Biddeford. And a key factor in selecting the Biddeford River was also the identification of a collaborator willing to let us use his lease space. So thank you to Roger Palmer for that opportunity and for accommodating our team all summer and fall. Okay. So we collected samples from each group of oysters at the beginning and the end of the monitoring for MSX diagnosis by PCR and histology. We have not had those samples processed yet, so today I'm only presenting preliminary mortality data, not the MSX prevalence from the specific oysters that we were monitoring. So the preliminary results show that mortality was fairly consistent at about 20% for all 3 year classes from the Biddeford River population, but variable among year classes from the Savage Harbor population. But I note that the 2022 year class from Savage Harbor was deployed about a month after the 2023 and 24 year classes, so that shorter exposure time could very well contribute to the lower mortality rate. And additionally, for the higher mortality rate that's seen in the 2024 year class from Savage Harbor, half of that came within a week of deployment, and so we think that there may have been some stress from high temperatures during the transit time. However, these inconsistencies are going to be considered in the context of the MSX prevalence by PCR and histology once we have those data. However, from the from the monitoring that the province was completed, by the end of the summer, so Biddeford River had 23% prevalence in May. By the end of the summer, 87% prevalence of cultured oysters. So there was a significant increase in general in that area. At this point, the 2022 year class of oysters from the Biddeford River have been moved to our hatchery to begin conditioning for spawning to test that third objective of the project. Additionally, we have received funding for another project, but that one has not been publicly announced yet, so I can't go into great details. But the goals are to establish a potentially disease-resistant broodstock population as the start of a breeding program for Atlantic Aqua Farms. So obviously, we are just starting out on this. We're not at the point of the 2 hatcheries that we've already heard from today. For this project, we are using cultured oysters from the Percival River and the Enmore River, and wild oysters from Bedeque Bay. All 3 locations have had significant mortality. The Enmore River has also had a heavy dermo prevalence as well as MSX prevalence. The seed produced from this effort will take about 3 years to grow large enough for us to spawn those seed again and create the next generation. So we expect resistance to build with each subsequent generation, but expect a minimum of 2 generations to establish effective resistance. So this is the start of a long-term project, a long-term effort. Additionally, Atlantic Aqua Farms is also collaborating with external partners on research projects to better understand the MSX outbreak in general, including sequencing the MSX genome and developing non-destructive eDNA techniques for MSX and dermo detection. And so even though these projects are not working towards production of disease-resistant seed, a quick update on them. So for the MSX genome project funded through DFO, the team at the University of Laval is finishing to optimize the methods to enrich for MSX DNA. That will be followed by the sequencing. And then for the eDNA project, eDNA Tech is optimizing is the development of primers to amplify conserved regions of MSX and dermo using the positive controls provided by VIMS and Martin. And preliminary sampling plans are completed, sampling supplies have been ordered, sampling will start in the spring. Okay, so now I'm going to move on to our proposals for short-term approaches to produce disease-resistant seed. Atlantic Aqua Farms hatcheries in Maine have been using the Rutgers University NEH Haskin line of broodstock since the Maine MSX outbreak in 2010. Switching to using that line of broodstock allowed recovery of that production area from significant mortalities seen in 2011. They were above harvest levels from 2010 by 2013. So within 3 years of the outbreak starting, there were market oysters that brought it back to historic harvest levels. This line has strong resistance to MSX, moderate to strong resistance to dermo. It has been selected for growth and shell attributes, and it's selected for high salinity. It outperforms unselected oysters with regard to growth, but a key part is that this is a patented product. It is funded through a license fee on the seed, and that's a key point because that broodstock line can only be used by hatcheries to produce a single generation of seed. You cannot take those seed and spawn them again to produce the next generation. They cannot be worked into a breeding program. There are 2 different approaches to using this broodstock. One approach is to import biosecure disease-resistant seed from US hatcheries. That would require capital investment in nursery capacity. The seed would be MSX and dermo resistant and is produced in extremely large production level quantities at our main hatcheries. The second strategy would be to import the Rutgers NEH broodstock into quarantine facilities in PEI and then cross them after testing, have the sperm removed from the quarantine facility to cross with eggs from PEI oysters. And the benefit there would be that the seed would be resistant to MSX, dermo, and Malpec disease, However, our hatchery in Borden was designed and set up as a research hatchery. It has very limited production capacity. We are investing heavily in the infrastructure in our hatchery to scale up production capacity to meet the needs, greater needs of the industry. But even with that investment, we would not be able to produce this cross at the same level as the production coming out of our main hatcheries. So, in Maine, the hatcheries bring in NEH and Maine broodstock into their quarantine facilities. Every year, they condition them and they cross them to produce seed that is resistant to MSX and dermo. This seed is shipped from Maine all the way down south to Virginia, so it performs well across a broad geographic range. The big question here is how well it would do in PEI, because it is likely naive to Malpec disease. However, some of you in this room have pointed out to me that there was a thought that Malpec disease may have come from New England oysters to start with, and so there's a tiny chance that this seed could have some resistance, but I would note that there have not been mortalities in New Jersey or Maine associated with Malpec disease, so that is a small chance. I've also received questions about how oysters from New Jersey could survive a PEI winter. And so for that context, when we cross them with Maine broodstock, Maine winters, last winter got down to 0.5 degrees Celsius and was below 5 degrees for 2.5 months. And I know that that is not as cold as winters here, but we also did a trial holding 9mm seed in a walk-in refrigerator for 5.5 months last winter and had essentially 100% survival of that seed. So 9mm, pretty small size to survive that condition. So the approach of bringing the broodstock up here to cross with PEI oysters, we would import them into a quarantine facility in PEI, and then the seed that results would be resistant to MSX, dermo, and Malpec disease. This cross may have the best likelihood of success, but remember that our hatchery has limited production capacities despite investment there. Another question that I have gotten about this proposal relates to the reproductive potential, and would seed with foreign genetics compete with PEI genetics? So the Rutgers broodstock are available as diploids and tetraploids. On the left, we are looking at an example cross between diploids, producing diploid seed. On the right, we're looking at a cross using tetraploids from the NEH line and diploids from PEI oysters. And when you have mated tetraploids and diploids, the offspring are 100% triploids. The point here is that diploids reproduce and triploids are virtually sterile. The reproduction risk is very minimal. So if this is something that is a concern, the use of tetraploids from the NEH line to produce triploids would very much minimize that risk. An important consideration here is that that hatchery produced seed is very small, typically 1 to 2 millimeters when it leaves the hatchery to go to a nursery system. So we have some nursery capacity. PEI will need expanded nursery capacity to take advantage of the hatchery produced seed from any of the hatcheries that have presented today. And I know that the Oyster Disease Mitigation and Adaptation Program is providing some funding to increase nursery capacity, so that is fantastic. But also, hatchery seed is not inexpensive. This is just the reality of the production process for the labor and the resources that go into producing seed. We have heard from this session that the future of the industry depends on hatchery-produced seed, whether imported or local broodstock from any of the hatcheries that have presented. Growers on PEI are already facing financial difficulties. Some are counting months until they go out of business. And so I truly implore the government at the provincial and federal level to consider helping growers purchase hatchery seed. If you are facing going out of business, it is very challenging to think about making an investment in a product that you cannot sell for potentially up to 3 years or longer. So how would this work? What is the regulatory process? The importation must be approved by CFIA and DFO. The province also has the opportunity to provide feedback on the process. And I'm sure that you all know that Atlantic Aqua Farms has submitted applications for both the seed and the brood stock. I sincerely thank the oyster growers in this room for their support in our efforts. Despite that significant industry support, there is not a line of sight on approval for this process yet. So, had a meeting last Friday. I was not encouraged from that meeting that this might be a possibility for this year. We've had ongoing conversations with CFIA. They've had technical questions that has resulted in back and forth. At this point, we have elevated this to the highest level within CFIA and have our next meeting coming up this Friday. So we're not giving up yet. I know that there are people in this room who feel that not taking this risk is the biggest risk of all, or the idea of what do we have to lose to try this. I am there with you in that feeling, and I'm committed to continuing these conversations, but we'll see how this week pans out. And with that, I will end. Here is my contact information in case you would like to get in touch.